Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Stuart Yasker. I lead the Economic Architecture Project at Ashoka, and today I have the opportunity to welcome you all to the Economic Architecture Intensive. So our focus for today is on redesigning our markets to value assets in Black majority neighborhoods. This is the first of 3 sessions. It is entitled Learning About the Devaluation of Black-Owned Assets. There will be a second session, which will occur next Thursday, October 8th at 12 p.m. It will be entitled Exploring Emerging Innovations, and the third and final session will also be on Thursday, same time, October 15th at 12 p.m., and it will be entitled Design Session for Innovative Approaches. These 3 sessions are a precursor to a major effort by Ashoka and the Brookings Institution to launch a $1 million collaborative challenge with a focus on fostering a new generation of structural innovations that address devaluation of homes in Black majority neighborhoods. Like this intensive, the challenge is open to the public. So if you have a great idea, if you know somebody who's doing incredible work, we would love to hear from you. Please get in touch. Please let us know. I wanted to acknowledge that this intensive is an offering of the incredible SciCenter for Innovative Thinking at Yale, Sci-City for short. And the Sci-City mission is to inspire students from diverse backgrounds and disciplines to seek innovative ways to solve real-world problems. And they have a goal of engaging innovators along the way, which you can see on your screen in front of you. Now I'd like to introduce you just quickly to the panelists that we'll be learning from today. To start, Andre Perry. Andre is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, a scholar in residence at the American University, and a columnist at the Hechinger Report. He is also the author of the new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. It's available now. And he is the co-leader of the Ashoka Brookings Partnership. Next is Ann Price. Ann is the president of the Insight Center and is also a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute in New York. And she currently serves as board chair at the United for a Fair Economy in Boston. Ann's work has been featured in the New York Times, The Nation, The Washington Post, Mercury News, City Lab, O Magazine, and the Stanford Social Innovation Review, amongst many others. Anika Goss. Anika is joining us. She is the executive director for the Detroit Future City, a think and do tank focused on land use and economic development in Detroit. In this role, Anika leads a team of experts to coordinate data-driven strategies, actions, and resources to catalyze Detroit's long-term revitalization, and adds research and implementation capacity to the work of contributing partners and stakeholders. Recently, Anika has also spearheaded the beginning of the Center for Equity Engagement and Research in Detroit. And finally, we're also being joined by Karen DuBois Walton. Karen is the executive director of the Elm City Communities Housing Authority. I'm sorry, Karen is the president of the Elm City Communities Housing Authority for the city of New Haven. Karen's also the president of the Glendower Group and the 360 Management Group. In those roles, she's also responsible for an annual operating budget of over $120 million and a capital improvement plan valued at over $700 million. Karen resides in New Haven, and she is actively involved on a number of nonprofit boards, dedicating time to creating greater equity for those who are marginalized. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to everyone who's joining us online. We're looking forward to a valuable conversation. We are using the Q&A facility today on Zoom, so if you have questions, comments, please put all that information in the Q&A section. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Andre.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Andre Perry. I'm a scholar, a resident at American University, where I am today, but I'm also a fellow at the Brookings Institution. I'm going to share a few slides to talk about or give you some of the motivation behind what we're doing today. Let me slideshow, play from the start. Here we go. A lot of what you will hear is available in my new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. But as was stated, I look at Black majority cities where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%. And as you can see, there were more than 1,200 of them all across the country. I also study Black majority neighborhoods, and there are obviously thousands of those. The story begins here in my childhood home of Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. This is 1320 Hill Avenue. This is where I was raised, and as the story goes, that woman in the right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, her name is Elsie Boyd. She was about 63 years old when I was born, and there was a deal made between her and my maternal grandmother that she would take care of me. And it was because my mother, who already had a child at 15, was poor. She was probably abused, and during the time, Pittsburgh was undergoing a transformation in which the steel industry was starting to pull out of the city. And so, as you can see, many children needed support. Black children, white children, for the most part, in my area. And she took them in. Some stayed for a few weeks, some stayed for a few months. My brothers and I stayed until we graduated from high school. Part of the reason why that occurred is my father, pictured here, Floyd Criswell. He was in and out of prison. He had a heroin addiction, and eventually he was murdered outside of in a prison outside of Detroit, in Jackson Penitentiary, now known as Michigan State Penitentiary. He died from a single stab wound to the heart a day before his 27th birthday. But I say it all that context, put all that context to put this into perspective of housing devaluation. One, that home means so much more to me than what it is priced. It's about, well, anyone can pick it up for the amount of the taxes in the municipality. But I also go around the city and see similarly built homes priced for much higher. And so that's where the journey begins. But as you can see here, this is a chart that examines housing prices in Black neighborhoods. Along the x-axis, the horizontal axis at the bottom, that represents the share of the Black population in zip code. And as you can see, and along the y-axis is housing price. And as you can see, as the share of the Black population increases, home prices decrease, and it's pretty linear. So homes in areas where the share of the Black population is less than 1% are priced about $340,000, and they're half as much in areas where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%. Now, a lot of people will say that's because of education, that's because of crime, but those are things you can control for in the study, and that's what we did. We took that absolute price difference, and then we controlled for structural characteristics, so we could get a sense of the same homes with the same size, same number of bedrooms. We also use Zillow to get listing price, which gives you a sense of quality per square foot. But we also controlled for neighborhood characteristics, so education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics, so we can get an apples to apples comparison of homes. And what we found pretty much astounds, that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced. Again, these are equivalent homes, equivalent social circumstances, are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Accumulatively, that's about $156 billion. And you can see this is occurring all across the United States. You can get a sense of that. Wherever you see a magenta circle, that's where devaluation occurs. Wherever you see green circles, that's where homes in Black neighborhoods are actually priced higher than their white counterparts. But you can see the overall trend is around about devaluation. Memphis, about 22%, about 24,000 per home. And you can see this is occurring all over the country. I apologize, I forgot to put in New Haven, but there's devaluation also in New Haven as well. And so you see Lynchburg, Virginia, 81% difference. Rochester, New York, 65% difference. I mean, this is massive differences. Again, similar social circumstances, education, crime, all those different things. Similar structures. Again, there are some places where it is higher in Black neighborhood home prices. Nashville +10, Boston 23%. But let's be clear, Boston is no less racist than Lynchburg. Its home prices are just higher. But I just want to put this 156 billion in perspective. It would have financed more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount that Blacks use to start up their business. It would have financed more than 8 million four-year degrees based on the average amount of a four-year degree. Replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan nearly 3,000 times over. 97% of all of Hurricane Katrina damage, so it would have covered all that damage. Double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. The reason why I put that in there is because for so long the narrative was my father was a bad person. He went to jail because of his choices. Well, in my book, I followed where he lived. He lived in areas where there was significant housing devaluation, where wealth is being extracted from those different communities. I guarantee you, if he lived in a neighborhood that had the resources, he would have had better schools, better job opportunities, more likely to start a business, go to college. All of those things could have occurred. Instead, his behaviors were criminalized. He had substandard housing, substandard education. Again, this is the money. I failed to mention that that's the money that municipalities use to fund education, policing, infrastructure, all those different things. And that's why I always say that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. That we constantly blame people and not policy. But I wanted to show you moments of a hearing that I participated in on Capitol Hill. This is the Financial Services Committee, and that's Representative Al Green of Texas. And he asked a very basic question. Do you believe that there's discrimination in the housing market? Now, mind you, if there's any one sector that we have proven evidence of housing discrimination discrimination, it's in housing. Now take a look and listen to this exchange.
If you think Black people are being discriminated when their property is being appraised, would you kindly raise your hand? One person on the panel. If you think that, for fear that I'm not communicating well, if you think that Black people are not being discriminated against when their property is being appraised, if you think they're not being discriminated against, kindly raise your hand. Okay, hands now, we're getting some consternation, I see.
Now I'm going to stop sharing here. The reason why I showed that slide is because know that if we have people who clearly don't believe that discrimination exists, then that is a significant problem. I mean, a significant problem. But more importantly, that gap needs to change. We need solutions. We need to restore the value that's being extracted by racism. And this is not going to occur by waving a magic wand, policy wand, and increasing home prices, because if you did that automatically, you essentially lock out people from buying them. And so we need interesting, innovative strategies to both restore value and remove the drag of racism in those markets. So we need policy solutions and market-based solutions. No question about this. And there's many out there. It can occur at the local level, state level. It might be new mortgage projects we're talking about. It might be a tax credit program. But it has to occur in many different ways and many different levels. That's why we're here, to find solutions. And we want solutions from people and firms and organizations that are proximate to the problem. Too often, it's someone doing the solution from a desk from somewhere in a back office in Washington, D.C., completely removed from the situation. No, I'm not completely removed, but I am in the back office in Washington, D.C. But that's why we're here. And so we invited a few people to have this discussion about the importance of dealing with devaluation. And as was mentioned, Ann Price, Karen Dubois, and Anika Goss, they're here to join me in this discussion. So I think I can just go ahead and bring them in. Is that correct, Stuart? That's right. So I'm going to ask them a series of questions to get at this issue of the valuation. I'm going to first start with Anne. And Anne is an expert on wealth and structural racism. And I really just wanted to have her just talk about when you see those slides and you see that 156 billion and you see the loss of wealth. Can you give the audience a sense of the importance of wealth on one's life outcomes, and what in general do we need to solve it?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for those slides, Andre. They're so powerful. You know, wealth is still not very well understood in this country. And largely because we have a narrative that dominates our society that is about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And that narrative really dictates in people's minds that how you build wealth is through your individual efforts. And if you can't do that, then there's something fundamentally wrong with you. And that's where we get the story wrong, because wealth in this country was largely seeded through government's investment in people. And the government over time has invested trillions of dollars in American cities, in places, and people, but it hasn't done so evenly. So this idea that somehow you get a job and you kind of magically can start to accumulate wealth and become what we call wealthy is largely untrue. That wealth is passed down from generation to generation. And I often think about it as it is the roots underneath the tree that you can't see, right? So we're often talking about the branches and the leaves, but really it's the roots underneath that really foster the ability for that tree to stand and to stand tall. And that's what wealth really is. You know, when we think about wealth, and we really see it as the best economic measure, because it really does enable people to get through the hardest times. And we know we're living in an economic crisis in a pandemic. And so when you lose your job, when your hours are cut, when your household is disrupted, wealth is that sense between security and catastrophe. So it gets us through the hard times, but also importantly, it enables us to actually live out our own dreams and aspirations, right? It allows us to then go off and think about how we can invent new products, how we can start a business, and yes, how we can buy a home. And it is that wealth that enables more wealth to be gained, right? It's like we say, wealth begets wealth. So it's not just about like opening a business, it's the wealth behind it that enables someone to be able to thrive and get through the difficult aspects of actually starting a business. It is the ability to build equity, as you talked about, Andre, and that often requires wealth in the first place. So, you know, wealth is our North Star when we think about well-being in this country.
And I just want you to clarify one thing, because oftentimes we say education predicts for wealth, or marriage behaviors cause wealth. So can you just situate that for me again so that people can really hear that?
Yes, I think that largely what wealth does is actually just flips the script on our most kind of dominant thinking. It totally flips the script. So we often think that if people can actually just get a college degree, they can accumulate wealth. If people actually had a heteronormative marriage, that would actually solve for wealth. And when we really break this down, particularly by race and even gender, these things just don't hold true. So, for example, a Black family with a household head that has a college degree has less wealth than a white household whose head of household actually dropped out of high school, right? These things just don't play out in many communities of color, and certainly don't play out for Black Americans. that education has not been that bridge to kind of build wealth. In fact, we're seeing, for example, solo moms and Black women who are not married don't have wealth until well past their 40s. Like under 40, there's absolutely no wealth there. And in fact, their wealth portfolio looks similar to people who've not gone to college, right? So these notions, these common notions about what will be a panacea for wealth, just open a business, get a college degree. If we could actually get people to get married, these are often common kinds of approaches and solutions that just don't hold true, particularly for Black people.
Now, I just want to be clear that the wealth gap is, at least by the latest numbers by the Federal Reserve, about 170,000 to 17, about 10 times. And when we talk wealth in a very financial terms, we're talking about assets minus debts. Now, I'm going to turn to Anika Goss, who I will allow her to just briefly say her her organization, what it does. But Anika Goss is in Detroit, the biggest and technically blackest city in the nation. So, and she's doing excellent work there. So, Anika, can you just describe what you do, as well as what are some of the barriers you're seeing in Detroit? And what are some of the things that you're doing to combat those barriers?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Andre. So Detroit Future City is a think and do tank. So we focus on innovation and research focused on land use and sustainability and economic development at the neighborhood level in Detroit. And what we think about sustainability is the connection between the economic opportunity in the physical environment, so the use of open space and land, and the use of water and water management, as well as growing wealth and increasing equity and opportunity for families in Detroit. So that's what we do. And our Center for Equity Engagement and Research is really bringing that together in terms of how we actually produce reports, track data, understand what's happening to households over time. What was the second part of the question? Oh, wait, you're on.
Yeah, so barriers and some of the things that
Yeah. So a big part, what we're seeing barriers, I'm really glad Ann brought up COVID, is the disparity in Detroit. The way Detroit is organized, unlike some other communities, the core of the city is 78% African American. It's the largest majority African American city in the country. But the suburbs, most of the suburbs on average are about 65 to 75, depending on the community, percent white. So you have this reversal where the suburbs are much wealthier, much whiter, opportunity and resource rich. Whereas Detroit over time has the largest city in the state, has concentrated African Americans and concentrated people of color, because there are a large number of immigrants and Latinos as well that live in Detroit, but also a very high rate of poverty and a very significant disparity in wealth. So when COVID hit and we began to really see this decline of both jobs and small business, and this fear of eviction, because foreclosure is a real problem, is also a continued problem here. What we're actually seeing are all of those things are true, but housing rates are continuing to go up because people from other places are wanting to move to a much more affordable city, which, to your point, in your book, I know I'm going to give you a big plug in your book because I just finished it. the idea, the devaluation that's happened over time in Detroit is now allowing for this whole new market of people who are in very high markets to buy cheap in Detroit and change the dynamic very quickly. The other problem that we're really seeing in Detroit is the disparity in income. Not only, and I mean, you can live in Detroit and make $20,000 less, same degree, same education, same job as your suburban counterpart, right? So the two teachers, two fourth grade teachers will make $20,000 less if you're a Detroit public school or a Detroit teacher, as opposed to a suburban fourth grade teacher with the same credentials, same tenure. That's what we're talking about. Those are the kinds of things that actually keep us from moving forward very quickly.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the point is that home prices impact how much revenue schools have and who they can hire. And so it's absolutely connected. Housing is such an important lever. And again, I just want to be clear that there are some big financial assets in the Detroit area, meaning car manufacturing and transit work. And there's been a long history of battle about where those assets should be. Can you just briefly talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Detroit over time has lost a significant, starting in the 60s, we saw a huge shift in the economic engines that were really driving a solid job base of Detroit, including manufacturing, which is still the primary driver in the region. But many of the headquarters, all of the headquarters actually at one point had moved out of Detroit. General Motors headquarters have since moved back in. But what we continually see, and if you look at job growth rates in Detroit, is that it's actually for Detroit, that is not the driver. Manufacturing is no longer the number one job base and certainly not the highest growing rate for Detroiters. And in fact, and this is something that we're actually dealing with, Detroit, because of the previous recession, Detroit's job growth rate is one of the top rates in the country in terms of how much it's grown over time. It's at 17%, which is very, very high. However, those are the jobs that are in Detroit. Detroiters themselves are not working in those jobs. So Detroiters' commute times, Detroiters' wages and how much they're actually making is much, much lower, where Detroiters are traveling out to those same manufacturing jobs further and further out, those same service industry jobs that are making a lot less money than the jobs that are here in Detroit. And that's a real problem that we're seeing.
Now I'm going to kick it over to New Haven. And Karen's doing a lot of great work over in New Haven, and I want her to describe who you are, what you do, and again, some of the barriers, and as well as I'll also say what are some of the opportunities, some of the things that you're doing in New Haven to combat some of these issues.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Andre Stewart. It's great to be here with Ann and Anika, and I resonate with so much of what you've talked about in your examples, and want to bring it a little to the focus of what's happening here in Connecticut, which is one of the most segregated states in our country. And here in New Haven, you might wonder sort of what is a public housing authority person doing on this panel? But we are serving families that have been disadvantaged from the decades of housing policy in this country and Connecticut's housing policies as well, resulting in the kinds of disparities we see in the families that we're serving. We operate the two major federal housing programs, the Low-Income Public Housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which folks know as Section 8 in many communities. And when you look to the history of housing policy, nationally and here in Connecticut, you see very clearly the ways in which home ownership, as Andre so clearly connected that to how people generate wealth, was made possible for white families and in suburban settings, and was denied to families of color. And we see very early with the 1920 Zoning Enabling Act in the state of Connecticut, ways in which the suburban communities were designed for white folks and were clearly established to block multifamily housing, so to block anything that would provide a sort of pathway into these communities and a pathway into home ownership. We see the federal government, and all of the redlining policies, all the ways in which suburban development was incentivized for white families and blocked for families of color. You see us coming out around right after that U.S. Housing Act here at what was at the time called the Housing Authority in the City of New Haven around 1938, building large-scale housing developments in the redlined zones, in the areas, and you start to see families who have more opportunity being able to move into the suburban communities. And so what we are faced with today is, despite the fact that the Connecticut Black population is about 12%, you see that the families that we serve in the Housing Authority are 60 to 70% Black families. We are a city where we should see, based upon our own demographics of the city, about a third white, a third Black, a third Latinx. But instead you see very few, very small percentage of white families needing the housing subsidy programs and an overrepresentation of families of color. So you see that the end product in the families that we're serving today of decades-long history of deprivation of wealth, of incentivizing rental housing for Black families and home ownership for white families. When you think about we've got a neighboring town, Woodbridge, which is a very wealthy, very white community, which would take me 7 minutes to drive to from where I am right now. Majority white community, and some of the most restrictive zoning practices that have kept it such that unless you're going to build on 2 acres, a single family, you're not going to have an opportunity in. But when you roll back and look at housing development in the 40s, and the first homes that were allowed there, that someone might have gotten into, a white family might have gotten into for $6,000 or $7,000, that small modest cape, which is not even what's being built in that community anymore, is now $300,000, $400,000 home. Right, that's wealth that white families were able to acquire that our families weren't. So we use our role in the Housing Authority as a quasi-governmental, now able to design some housing solutions right here as a way to think about how are we reversing that history for the families we're serving today. And we do it through a couple of things.
Go for it. Yeah, I was just going to get to that.
Yeah. First of all, we invest heavily in the communities that we're already in. So solution cannot be walking away from the predominantly Black communities in the city of New Haven where our families have been. So we are invested in a huge capital improvement investment initiative here that is rebuilding communities in ways that creates not just the infrastructure, because what I'm really in it for are the people. My background is psychology. I'm a clinical and community psychologist. I do this for what we do for our families. And so we're building communities that are service rich, amenity rich, and offer a range of income levels opportunity to live in our communities. And in that, we are investing in the families who are in those communities. And so there are all sorts of things that need to happen around helping people deal with their education gaps and workforce gaps, and we do all of that. But the other thing that helps people move from asset poor to asset rich is money. And so we actually do a whole set of things that are about wealth transfer. We have a program where when families complete their own sort of life course of things that they want to do and graduate the program, they graduate with a check from us that is the value of 1 year's worth of subsidy. So families are leaving here able to then go into the private market as a rentor at the private market, or many of them going into the market as a homeowner because they've gotten the opportunity to build their skills, save along the way, and then graduate with this check that is typically upwards of $10,000 to be used on something that will further their journey. I think it's that kind of investment of those same federal resource and policies that were used to keep wealth from families that need to be flipped over and think about how is that used to invest in families to repair some of this damage.
Wow, let me tell you a little something. Cut the check. At the end of the day, cut the check. If you invest in place and not people, you essentially encourage gentrification. No question about it. You need to cut the check. That's how we get out of these recessions and depressions, by giving resources directly to people. Now, that's a great transition because I also want to talk about the current moment. I'd be remiss if we did not talk about how COVID-19 and social distancing is impacting wealth creation in Black and brown communities, Black neighborhoods in particular. I'm going to go back to Ann on this one. What are you seeing being played out in terms of the consequences of the pandemic on wealth creation in Black neighborhoods?
Well, it's a great question, and I think that we don't really even begin to know how this is going to play out over time, right? And I think that's why this is such an important moment, particularly to be in community as much as we can with people and research, because this is quite different than what we saw in 2008 when actually it was a particular asset that was grabbed. Now we're going to see these kind of cascading effects. Anika really spoke to something very important that's happening in Detroit and all over the country, which is really occupational segregation, when people are actually unnaturally packed into certain jobs because of race and gender, and often paid at lower, paid less, which she also articulated. So when you combine that with the fact that people have lost jobs, just a couple of months ago, we learned that only half of Black people in the country were working. When you see this play out for public sector workers who are particularly hard hit and were hard hit in the last recession. So this idea of job loss, which then has an effect of how you kind of maintain an asset, is usually through income, which really threatens that asset. We have this, people are stepping up and stepping in for others. That means that they may be sacrificing their own well-being for parents, for siblings, for children, pulling money out of retirement, or not saving, or draining their savings. So we know that we're in a particular crisis. How it's being played out is not exactly clear, and we really need to understand that more. But I'm really deeply concerned that, for folks who just have not recovered, and also appreciate you and Nika talking about that foreclosure is still an issue in many communities, that this might just push people, we might see greater foreclosure. So there is a lot for us to be concerned about when it comes to wealth in Black families right now, that we might have never seen in our lifetime. And we really have to keep a keen eye out for it.
And I want to underscore that this is a health crisis, and in terms of bad debt, the kind of debt that Black people take on that's not collateralized. Healthcare becomes an issue, does it not?
Oh, it's a huge issue, right? Medical debt continues, is particularly Black people tend to have higher share of medical debt than white families, and we know who's disproportionately affected by COVID. We've seen reports where people have talked about getting hospital bills of up to $1 million that actually health, even if you've had mild cases of COVID, that those health issues can continue driving up health costs. And so we know that there's going to be a disproportionate impact. Another area of concern is student debt. Although there might be a reprieve for a little bit, with lost income, coming out of this crisis, could actually drive up default rates. And Black people already have higher levels of default because of the jobs that they're in, because of higher rates of unemployment. And once you default, it takes years and years and years to be able to even have an asset, right? It becomes very difficult to purchase a home or to start a business or, and it holds back people from a lot of decisions that they would ordinarily make. So we have a real intersectional crisis that we have to keep our eye on. That's really about the economy, about the health crisis that we're seeing.
I'm going to turn it over to Anika. I want to ask the same question, but at a local level. How is this played out? Because I think Ann articulated that, or conveyed that when you have housing devaluation, you don't have that cushion to deal with these kind of shocks, and it really impacts. So what are you seeing on the ground in Detroit?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, COVID was this great equalizer, which, it was hitting communities across the board. Our response to COVID and how you were able to recover, whether you were able to recover physically as well as financially, was really the mirror that I think we're all looking at together in a local community. What I will say, I think that there are a few things that I'm really concerned about. One, as I mentioned, the housing market, because I think in 2008, because the housing market was so widespread, it allowed for a lot of policy changes to happen really quickly that would secure some of that would try to recover some of these neighborhoods all at once. Because, as Ann said, we're going to be pacing over time and seeing how this sort of plays out. And you have people who are from higher housing markets now investing in Detroit. You're not seeing the neighborhoods emptying out. You're actually seeing housing values go up. So if housing values go up and rental markets go up, you're not seeing these spaces, but the people who were there are having to leave because they're foreclosing on mortgages or being evicted due to rent or taxes or something else. It's not quite as obvious. And so it's harder to create policy around that. So that's one thing that keeps me up at night. The other thing that keeps me up at night that we're working really hard on in Detroit is the small business community and what that actually means in a neighborhood. And in a place like Detroit, we don't have a lot of the big box retails here. Detroit is made up of a whole series of small businesses, whether they're, and small businesses in the African American community in particular are made up of service and retail, the two highest risk businesses in Detroit or in the country, wherever, right? So they're already operating on very, very thin margins. And now after being closed for 6 months, we're seeing a lot of these businesses lose first. And as all of these big banks are making big, promises, investments, we're making a lot of policy, we are really forced to work together differently and have really, really hard conversations around the history of discriminatory lending practices in the Black and Latino communities, and what that actually looks like if you want to save the city. Because that's what this is about at this point, is if in fact we want to save our urban cities, you have to think about how you make investments, what policy looks like very differently.
Karen, I'm going to ask you the same thing. How is this playing out in New Haven?
Yeah, I've been thinking about the expression when the white America gets the cold, Black America gets pneumonia. I don't know what it is when white America gets COVID. I don't know what it is that Black America gets, right?
That's a word.
It has been devastating. So, our family, I got to connect to what you've been saying, Anika. Our families tended to be the folks that were sort of laid off, lost their jobs early in the pandemic. or they were the folks who worked those low-paid frontline jobs that required them to put themselves on the line in the service industry, in the healthcare industry, in real frontline kinds of positions. And so that was really devastating. I've been concerned about the mismatch and the misunderstanding I think people have about how hard and how expensive it is to be poor. And there were a lot of the relief methods that were being put out were not being offered necessarily for our families, because the assumption was, well, if you're in subsidized housing, you get your rent adjusted and you shouldn't need anything else. And it just totally misses the match, I think, misses the point around how difficult it is to be poor. So one of the things we did, we were able to do at least for a month, was cancel rent for all our families. So the month of July, nobody who lived with us paid any rent. With the idea that we understand how destabilizing this is, how many other expenses are coming up, all the challenges, the loss of income, all of that, and that it doesn't, and that our families needed something more. So, those are some of the things that we're seeing and are bracing for what it will mean for the private market when these sort of eviction moratoriums and things lift. We are very concerned about what will happen for families that use our subsidy and rent from the private market as landlords start to need to deal with this disruption that's occurred in terms of their rental flow. So we're poised for, I don't think we've even begun to see what this is going to mean.
Sorry about that. Wow, man, you guys are doing some innovative things. I'm going to encourage people to send their questions in the chat. Before I get to this first question, I want just a quick rapid fire response to a question around, we're clearly in the midst of a presidential run. Everybody go register if you haven't already, because everyone should be voting, by the way. But I want to just ask it in very 30-second areas. If you could influence the agendas of the presidents in a way, and let's say they're both neutral in this case. If you could just influence the agenda, and you could find one area in housing, that policy area that you would recommend, what would it be? And I'm going to actually go backwards, and I'm going to go to Karen, because you said a few things there that I think you might have some solutions in mind.
Yeah, don't be afraid of the word reparations, right? That this is so clear. This is so clear, the history, that the governmental role in this was not a, some mean-spirited banker somewhere who just decided, I'm not going to write that mortgage, right? This was policy that was set out, governmental policy, and so it requires governmental solutions and reparations and repair for that. So I would certainly start there. And then, I am a strong believer in education and skills training and all of that, but lifting folks out of poverty takes cash, it takes money, and we have to be willing to put that on the line for folks who have been so disadvantaged.
Ooh, you're speaking my language. Anika, what you got?
Wow, I think that was great. I would just want to build off of what Karen said. We need to be thinking about housing as a system also, right? It's not just the number of units. Housing system includes property. It includes both rental and homeownership. It includes the right policy to make sure that people are staying in their homes equitably. It ensures that contractors have equitable access and opportunity to bid and win contracts to build housing, to rehab housing, and to demolish housing. Housing is an industry in its entirety, and in its entirety, it's been affected by COVID. So the federal policy that has to come into place has to support all of these efforts in order to strengthen a housing policy program. And most importantly, what I loved about this conversation around the intersection of wealth and housing is Karen's model of creating this subsidy is actually what will stabilize our neighborhoods as a whole, which is what's going to be so critical as we begin to see these neighborhoods change. Because, and I'm sorry, Ann, I don't want to take up your time, but I do want to say this one quick point, that 75% of white middle-class households live in middle-class neighborhoods, right? And that's in comparison to 33% of African Americans. So this is also about where we're choosing to live. Now, sometimes white people are choosing to live in other neighborhoods because it's grandmama's house and I'm gonna live in this neighborhood in grandmama's house. But the bigger issue about this is that if we are beginning to stabilize across a city and how we think about our policy and investment in creating opportunities for middle-class growth and stability, we have to make sure that we're also not investing in neighborhoods in our cities that will just double down in white middle-class communities and not growing a middle-class African-American, a middle-class Latino base in all of these cities. And that is a federal policy approach.
Excellent. I'm getting some word here. Ann, what you got? Oh, you're on mute. Okay.
Both Karen and Anika pretty much said it all. I don't have a lot to add to that. I will kind of combine the two and think about this both federally and also locally. Definitely need to keep the idea and the notion of reparations on the table, and HR 40 needs to be moved. But there's also a way we can think about that at the local level. Here in the Bay Area, there's something being launched called SF Hopes, and it is actually an effort to think about public housing and reparations in a local area, one that's been totally marginalized and disenfranchised. And so we need these local models. These are going to inform our national strategies. I think that's what's so exciting. I do like the idea of cash, and certainly mayors are jumping on board to try to have cash pilots in their cities because they know that people are short and being able to meet their basic expenses. We've seen that here in our pilot out here in California, where people really are using that money for basic things like food and housing. And so I think expanded efforts like that could be really telling. And we've seen that through the $1,200 stimulus check and how important that has been for people to use as they see fit in their lives. And I finally would close to say I am a big supporter of a young adult trust. I know there was a question about what do we do? We're looking for jobs coming out of Yale. What's the prospect there? But we definitely have to seed a generation with wealth. There is just no doubt about it. We are in a crisis to think that, millennials and any other generations are going to be able to weather through this crisis, through a student debt crisis, through a mass incarceration crisis without having any kind of capital to build on. So those are my three.
I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to just a few questions around this cutting the check. It's not, this happens all the time. In terms of public programs that actually gets equity to people. Can anybody on the panel just highlight a few prominent times in American history in which we cut the check, so to speak, to individuals? Anyone want? Oh, there you go.
Certainly, we can start with in our nation the Japanese who were interned during World War II, right? Who basically had their assets taken away from them, their businesses, their homes, when they were interned, and received some reparations for that. So we certainly have a precedent and to acknowledge when we've stolen assets from people, and that's one example.
A couple prominent ones, particularly around housing. Remember how we got out of the Depression? We gave low interest loans, refinancing loans to white folks, down payment assistance. Exactly. Remember that? Karen, you want to speak on that?
I mean, I was going to say that's the whole history of how the suburbs were developed. It's the timeline that I sort of flew through in the first question, is really all the ways in which GI Bill subsidized suburban developments are subsidized housing. I tell people all the time, when you hear subsidized housing, you think about the developments that I'm managing. But the major housing subsidy program in this country subsidizes single family home ownership, right? The mortgage interest deduction program is a federal subsidy that keeps people in homes that are upwards of $500,000. You can still get the deduction, right? So we subsidize wealthier folks' home ownership as a program. There's so many ways in which we are transferring wealth away from the lowest income folks and benefiting folks at the top of the chain that we could flip and benefit the kinds of investments that need to be made.
Now, there's a question here around urban renewal in the 60s. Can someone speak to that? But I think there's some urban renewal going on right now. It might not be termed as such at these times, but can somebody talk about the urban renewal in the 60s and what that has meant to Black communities in particular?
Anika, you look like you're going to jump in, then I'll go.
Okay. Well, I was going to say it was in the 60s where they created freeway approaches as part of the urban renewal strategy that went through almost every major city in the country, including right here in Detroit, that interrupted a lot of our neighborhoods and created, I mean, it was almost doubling down into this segregationist approach of where you divided a neighborhood so much that it makes it difficult for it even to grow. And I would add to that, not only were you finding the freeways, which is what we all talk about a lot, but the industrial parks and railways that are also dividing neighborhoods like Detroit. A lot of this is seen in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, a lot of other cities that are divided up in a way where you can't even do the kind of economic development for those specific neighborhoods to grow. So you end up creating a poverty pocket or industry that's either no longer there or is obsolete to the people who are living in that neighborhood.
Yeah, I was just going to add that far too often urban renewal has meant eliminating Black neighborhoods for the benefit of somebody else, right? So highways were often for the benefit of bringing people in or out of the city, right? So the benefit of the suburban folks. Some of the development that we seen in New Haven wiped out entire neighborhoods also for highway development, or to gentrify and bring in a different community. So you see urban renewal leading to gentrification also. So typically hasn't resulted in an investment for the folks that were originally there in the neighborhood.
And I'm going to pose this last question to Ann. Ann and I have been working together in the last few weeks, and we've been discussing this concept called community wealth. Can you talk how these policies of the past negatively impact not necessarily individual wealth, but the wealth in the community?
Yeah, and I know that Anika and Karen can really speak to this from their vantage point. You know, we think about being able to leverage the assets, both kind of financial and less tangible or financial assets that people in community bring to actually create a thriving, vibrant community. And that's what we're really seeking when we think about community wealth. You know, certainly when you think about a history that's predicated on segregation, where so much is constantly being taken, then you're talking about communities whose wealth and so many aspects, both individually and through structures and institutions, has been siphoned off or has been stymied and limited over time. And, you know, then you start to see aspects of how community can lack some of that is in physical infrastructure, but other means, other access to the kinds of amenities, even things like parks and libraries and things that enable a community to thrive and really bring, assets to a community that they can continue to build on. That's all that's been kind of robbed in Black communities, but I know that my other panelists can speak to that quite well.
Okay, yeah, quickly, I do want you, I know we're running out of time here, but Anika, Karen, quickly, community wealth. What does that mean to you?
I think community wealth is the creating opportunity for local growth for both businesses and housing and education opportunities locally, where you're much more intentional about that, place-based, so in an actual neighborhood.
Karen?
The only thing I'd add to that is I think we have to recognize the value that the urban center brings to the whole region, and the way in which the entire region is not necessarily contributing to the economic vibrancy of the urban center.
Woo! I mean, this has been such a powerful session. I want to thank Anika, Karen, and Ann for joining me. You provided great thoughts, and I heard a lot of solutions in there. And these are the kind of things we want to incentivize. And so the whole goal of this is, and you'll hear about this architecture of inequality soon. We want to break that down, but we hope that you continue with us. We'll be here same bat time, same bat channel. I know I'm dating myself. Those who understand that are probably of a certain age. Those who don't, you go Google it. But we'll be back next week. Stuart and I will be talking about these issues with another group, and then we'll tease some information about an opportunity for all of you to help develop solutions to solve this problem. So with that, on behalf of Stuart Yasgur and myself, I want to say thank you for joining us. This has been a wonderful session.